Um, Name's Mohammed Dhalech. As Victoria mentioned, I'm a Churchill Fellow and also have a whole range of other roles in life. I'm actually a full-time student at the moment, studying for a PhD on race and rurality, particularly exploring some of the heritages, particularly racially minoritized heritage in rural Britain across England and Wales. I've just started that over the last year. I'm also involved in various other programs, including volunteering for the Yorkshire Dales National Park and a few other parks, and active in a range of other activities. And one of my biggest passions in actually engaging and taking groups out, particularly from ethnically diverse communities, into the outdoors. And I'll talk about some of that over the coming 30 to 40 minutes. Where did my journey begin in terms of national parks and also the outdoors generally? Um, it was very much as a teenager when I started to win the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme um, in Gloucestershire. And that got me into the outdoors as in secondary school, and that continued post leaving school, but also it got me into youth work as well. And as as a youth worker, my focus was around the outdoor education. So I did a lot of work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme within Gloucestershire Youth Service for many years, training groups and taking groups out, which spread across the whole of Gloucestershire. And that also introduced me to a lot of the national parks, right through from the Brecon Beacons, through to the lakes, through to the Yorkshire Dales, the Cairngorms, and other areas. And one of the things I noticed just before I went to study in Ilkley for my youth work course, and the reason I chose Ilkley was because on the edge of the moor, access to the Yorkshire Dales, and a whole range of other activities, and the great late Pete Livesey used to teach there as well. Um, was the outdoor aspect of it. But one of the things I noticed at that time was the lack of young people engaged in some of those activities and programs, but also how few, if any, instructors there were engaged in the outdoor sector. And that really got me sort of interested in how I address some of these issues, working with not only the youth service, but also with a range of other organizations across the country. I remember doing a piece of research with at that time what was called the Adventure Education Association, looking at some of the governing bodies and their engagement with particularly race equality and inclusivity. And some of the replies I got back were quite interesting to read now in terms of they didn't see any issue or there wasn't any problem in engaging with those communities and that it wasn't a priority for them. That carried on to taking groups out, but also was heavily engaged in 2000 with what was then the Countryside Agency around the diversity review they carried out post the Rural White Paper in 2000. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are not in any way new, but they're actually been around for the last 20, 30 years. And a large number of people have engaged with those issues and talked about those issues and written about them and campaigned about them for many years in the past. So what I'm saying now is quite sort of similar, and Glover in the landscapes review has said some of the very similar issues in 2019. So that's a bit about me. And I've continued that work, and particularly sort of sustainable engagement in the outdoors and national parks. And I was involved with the Mosaic program with the Campaign for National Parks under the national parks for quite a number of years, and that's carried on until now. And we continue to work around that with a whole range of organisations. Just over the last two weekends, we were out as part of the YHA Festival Walks, And then the previous weekend, we did a volunteering weekend. And again, I'll talk about some of this work a bit later on. So my activities are very much about sustainable long-term engagement and organizational change and addressing some of the issues that are faced in the national parks and in the outdoors. So if I move on, um, I've done a bit of an introduction. I'll do a bit more of a context, looking at sort of three themes I've picked out: racism, organizational culture, and representation, and then looking at the future and some reflections for us to think of, and also maybe pose some questions for you as well. I want to start with this quote from John Dower in 1945. Um, and I think it sort of says it all. National parks are for people of every class and kind from every part of the country. They're not for any privileged or otherwise restricted section of the population, but for all those who care to refresh their minds and spirits and to exercise their bodies in a peaceful setting of natural beauty. And I think it's something to think about in terms of what John Dower's vision was that many years ago, and why are we sort of talking about inclusive national parks when he thought and his vision was that parks are for every class and kind of people from every part of the country. And it's something to sort of explore in terms of that conversation sort of 70, 75 years later is still going on. So have we actually moved forward, or are we still sort of stuck in a particular way? This then sort of brings me to something more recent, which again the landscapes review highlighted that many communities in Britain feel that these landscapes hold no relevance for them, and the countryside is seen by communities as a very much a white environment. And if that is true today, then the divide is only going to widen as society changes, and our countryside will end up being irrelevant to the country that actually exists. And I think that's something important to think about in terms of what we're saying now in 2019 to what was said in 1945. And has anything changed? And this is where, for me, is looking at some of the fundamental issues around some of the challenges of racism and discrimination, about organizational culture, and then around looking at representation and then how that future looks like. And if people are not engaging with the national parks and the national landscapes, then who are they, and how are we going to make it relevant to those communities to engage? Some of you may have seen this, not only this slide, but also some of the comments here. You might recognize the guy in the middle, Harun Mortar, from the Muslim Hikers Active Inclusion. And every time they go out for a walk, they post something. This is some of the issues they get on their social media channels, whether you're looking at Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. And they want to go out and enjoy the countryside, but what they're faced with when they come back. And this is just one example of some of the things that a lot of people experience in our communities who are visiting the park. So it's almost sort of, on one hand, people are saying their parks and national parks are inclusive and accessible to all, but on the other hand, when you access those spaces, and then you post the positive experiences you've had, you then get the trolls coming out with the views. And that's also sort of indicated in some of the statistics around hate crime as well, where in certain areas of our national parks that has increased in number. Moving on, these are some more images and clips that were seen over the last 4 or 5 years. You can see sort of on the left two banners. I think one was in Mamtor and one was, I think, in the Lake District, and then on the right on the south coast in Dorset. Um, and the sort of examples that people were was somebody was putting out that culturally diverse crowds blamed for seaside litter and vandalism. And I know, living in Cumbria and being around the Lake District, that particularly around COVID, it wasn't any visitors. It was primarily local people who were leaving litter behind and others. And the middle piece is actually a response that the that number of us did, and again with a view to looking at the spirit of Kinder and why we need to rethink the right to roam. And I know there's a lot of work going on around the right to roam at the moment. Um, Moving on, and I think that sort of raises a question. And again, Glover highlighted they did a Vox Pox as part of their review. And one of the people told them that they got inquisitive look, and that's common. And I've noticed that for the last 30, 40 years, when in the countryside, and comments like, look, an Asian person in the woods or something similar. And the team that were filming this Vox Pops directly experienced this when visiting with those communities and had to stop filming to minimize stares from passers-by. And I noticed that only a few years ago when I was at along Hadrian's Wall with Matt Baker doing some filming with Countryfile. So it's something that people regularly sort of experience. And this raises that question is do I belong? Do we belong in the national parks, in the countryside, or is it an um, exclusive arena for certain groups of people? And this then sort of takes me on to that exclusive group of people, which again highlighted what Glover talked about, that today that there's a recognition that diversity is a healthy and resilient society, and it's also recognized that diversity actually makes organizations more profitable and a lot more effective and efficient. But he highlighted that many landscape bodies have not moved smartly enough to reflect this changing society, and in some cases, have shown little desire to do so. And I think that the second point there really does highlight something that we're all paying for national landscapes through our taxes. And yet sometimes on our visits, it's felt as if national parks are an exclusive, mainly middle class club with rules only members understand, and much too little done to encourage first time visitors. And I got to say, this obviously is 2019, and there has been quite a number of work. But again, I'll come back to that a bit later on. But it's what type of work's going on, and is that sustainable engagement happening across? And this is where that organizational culture comes in. Is are we just looking at visitors coming in, or are we looking at it more broader in terms of a whole range of other areas of national park work? And you'll see there's lots of different images as I go through the slides, and they reflect a range of different groups that have gone out to particularly that have involved myself taking groups out to different parts of different national parks across the country. And this one again was something that we did again. There's this sort of thing, and it try to dispel that sort of myth about you don't need to wear certain clothes. This was a walk we did in the Peak District, wearing cultural clothes. So everybody who came, whatever country they're from, whether it was Africa, India, South America, they wore their own cultural clothes to show and demonstrate their identity as to who they are. And I think something else to think about as well is the way we visit and use the countryside is changing. And that's changed for many years over time. And I think it's worth looking at is there are charity walks, volunteering, mountain biking, there's festivals, there's a lot more swimming and boarding, glamping. art trails and so on. But again, we also know that there are large parts of society that have no relationship with them at all, and their popularity of those activities hides some big differences in the types of people who enjoy them, and some still remain excluded from some of those access. And also, it's, when you look at sort of culture, is how organizations in the environmental and outdoor sector and the national parks are looking at in terms of the demographics and the time of visitation as well. As a volunteer, but for a number of parks, you see different patterns of when people visit. And are we accommodating those different patterns of visitations, or are we operating still a 9 to 5 sort of operation, not considering that in summer months people may still be out till 9, 10 o'clock, and different audiences are visiting at different times of the days, which makes the markets very different. But also looking broader, how are local businesses also looking at the diversification of the national parks? If you've got more people coming in, more people sort of engaged and visiting, are they responding to those changing demographics of their visits, but also changing needs of their visitors in those areas? And again, you can count back over many years where people have had very interesting experiences in terms of not being served, or where they are placed in a restaurant if they go and eat, um, because they are different. And sadly, that still goes on. Only sort of recently, about a year ago, a colleague of mine's who worked for a cottages company, um, who was working there in the office, said they would refuse bookings from anybody with a foreign sounding name. So again, it's sort of those sort of things still go on within the national parks and providers of services and hospitality. And also, we're going to look at some of the history around the national parks as well. Whether you look at the Yorkshire Dales, around Dent and other areas, these two images were taken in two different places. One is in Northumberland, and the other one is in Cumbria, around Hadrian's Wall, and the African history around along the Hadrian's Wall. And again, are we recognizing that history, or are we sort of hiding it and sort of not putting it into that public domain for people to understand and know about the diverse history? That in itself could attract a lot of diverse visitors to visit some of those historical places in our national parks. And as I said earlier on, it's going beyond visitors and tourists, and not just seeing the need for inclusivity and diversification just for visitors. And yeah, we get visitors in, we can tick the box. But are our volunteers diverse? What about our staff at all levels? Whether you're looking at sort of frontline staff in information centers, rangers, etc., right through senior management, but also our governance, and how a local business is responding to this, as well, as I mentioned earlier on. And sort of exploring all those sort of different aspects of life in a national park, that we need to start thinking about, and in the environmental organization sectors as well, whether they're voluntary, whether they're public, whether they're private, they need to start thinking about those sort of things if you want to meet that diversity and inclusivity approach to the work you do. And this image, sorry, I'll just highlight some of the images. This image is um, actually in Vancouver in 2019 when I was part of my Churchill Fellowship, um, visiting Julia there. And she was an ambassador for MEC, one of the outdoor brands there. And again, there's a lot of outdoor brands who take on brand ambassadors and so on. But again, there's very little detailed work going on around inclusivity. But MEC at that time was one of the brands that put the head above the parapet in terms of challenging the brands across North America to actually do something around inclusivity and diversity. And what I mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of what I would say diversity washing, which was highlighted by a report around environmental professionals and environmental sciences in 2022. That first of all, the sector needs to demonstrate leadership and commitment to inclusivity and work on this as part of a core business and not just through in diversity washing initiatives. And this is where you have a short-term project, a 2 or 3 year project, and then as soon as the project ends, you move on to another project. Or we've got to find some money to do inclusivity or diversity because there is no money in our budget. And if that's the case, then it's never going to get embedded and nothing's ever going to change, but it needs to be embedded. And this is where the organizational cultural change comes in, that it needs to be embedded. It needs to be everybody's business, not just one individual, the engagement lead or the EDI officer. Yes, you might have somebody who coordinates this work as an EDI lead, but it needs an organizational commitment and leadership commitment to drive that work forward and change. And it's part of whether it's volunteering, whether it's finance, whether it's procurement, a whole range of things. Inclusivity and diversity is everybody's business in that work, and it shouldn't be just about, oh, we haven't got any money for a project or there's no money, but it needs to be sort of in that business plan, the strategic plan to make sure it's budgeted for and driven as an organization. Again, you'll probably recognize the left-hand image, which is from Harry Potter, on top of Madame Cove. And the image underneath is a group I took out, and we went up to Madame Cove, and they tried to recreate that sort of image on top of Madame Cove. And people want to experience those sort of things. And I know volunteering at Mallam on a regular basis, you get people coming up saying, "Can you tell me where Nadia Hussein did her program a few years ago with Fred Sirix?" So again, people sort of look at what's happening and then use that to come out and visit those places. And again, I've heard many times people say we've had a lot of problems engaging particularly the far Southeast Asian Chinese communities. This was back about 7, 8 years ago. Again, this is I think Janet's Voss, where we took a group of Chinese community from Liverpool for a weekend. And again, I've taken them 2 or 3 times over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And I think there's sometimes a bit of a challenge in terms of, is there actual engagement going on with different communities, or do you just sort of wait for people to land on you or come over to you? Whereas I think there needs to be a lot more outreach work to engage with these diverse communities, to build relationships with those communities, because when you do build those relationships, they bring out long-term changes and impact as well. So I know on the left-hand side, the Harry Potter image, those 2 young women, for almost 15 or 20 years, they came on a regular weekend with me, and they've gone and done their own things. One of those individuals who used to come on those weekends with me over the last 20 years is now doing an ML training program to take groups out. So things that start off when you were a child of 9 or 10 can over time be the seeds for what comes over in the future. So I think it's sort of looking at sort of a bigger picture rather than just a short-term picture. And I remember this group, we actually did some volunteering as well in one of the farms locally. So again, it's sort of looking at it from a different perspective. So I'm not looking at who are those people in that screen, but I'm going to flash up some names. There's some people know Black Girls Hike, Maxwell, Black Men Walking, an excellent speaker. Yep. So yeah, Maxwell Amber, he just literally in the last month or so got his PhD. Very active in the Sheffield environmental movement and a whole range of other outdoory national park stuff. And yes, was founder of the Black Men Walking. and also the play that came out from the idea. And Testament actually wrote that. So Testament is a poet, a spoken poet from Leeds, and he's doing some work with the Yorkshire Dales National Park at the moment, particularly around Dent. Shelton Johnson is a ranger in Yosemite, African American ranger, for over 30 years. He actually had a stint in London as well and in Germany because his father was in the military, so he traveled around with the US in the military. And he's done a lot of work in engaging African American and other audiences to visit Yosemite. He managed to get Oprah Winfrey to come and spend a night in Yosemite. Rihanna, I think people have mentioned, um, from Black Girls Hike. Again, Dr. Jacqueline Scott just completed a PhD in the last month or so. Very active in Canada around particularly getting people of different communities engaged in the outdoors, also urban environment as well. And also, Sia and a colleague have written a really good article in volunteering in environmental fields and worth a read in terms of some of the challenges as to people of color who engage in volunteering in Toronto. Yen Yen Chan is a Chinese ranger in Yosemite as well, and she's done a lot of work around looking at the history of the Chinese community in Yosemite. Both Shelton and Yen Yen have worked on their respective thing around sort of the Chinese over 100 years ago, working on either chefs or building railroads and laundries in Yosemite, and with Shelton Johnson about the African Americans who were the first rangers in the national park. Testament, as I mentioned, a poet, Narendra Bajara. Well, I think he is the first chair of a national park authority, the Peak District, around the 2008 to 2012 time. So you can see sort of we have had sort of successes, but I think his success was he was a local authority appointed member of the National Park Authority, but when he was the first chair of or first Asian chair or non-white chair of a National Park Authority, which is the Peak District. And Buffalo Soldiers, most people have heard of Buffalo Soldiers as Bob Marley's song and covered by other people, but they were actually an American regiment in the about 1870s, where they actually were the first rangers of Yosemite National Park before even the national park was incepted. So again, it's sort of looking at some of that history in our landscapes and countryside about what history that brings, both locally but also internationally. These are just some of the images of some of the people I've mentioned. And then going in to that sort of representation piece. And again, looking at national park authorities and M&B boards or now national landscape boards, the large majority are male, many of retirement age, and tiny fraction are of Black age minority ethnic. And as Glover turned around and said, this is wrong for organizations which are funded by the nation to serve everyone. There is a large gender imbalance across the membership as well, with 68% of members male, 30% female. And across the national parks and landscapes, there were less than 1% from ethnic minorities. And there were no members at that time across the board under the age of 25 and age 64. So again, you can see the lacking in diversity across the governance sector, and this is where that comes in. Again, if you sort of look at those two images, you can see they're very different. But I just want you to sort of think about those two images and give me some reflections of rough years, and are there any relationship or could there be any relationships? Right image was around maybe 88, um 88, 89 time. In yeah, 88, 90 time. And then the left image was in 2023. Um the middle one was, I think they're both in the same park in the Brecon Beacons National Park. But what's more interesting is I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse. Um, this person here who's leaning down on the side, at that time he was about sort of 15, 16, um, is this young girl's Lulu Stad, who's 20, a few years ago. This was his first experience, Faisal's first experience in the outdoors when I took him out back in sort of late 80s. And that stuck with him. And a lot of those people in that image, they're still active and engaged in that work. And then what you see is he's got three, four daughters and a son. They're all active in the outdoors in somewhere or other, and engaged in. And I think this is the important bit, as I mentioned earlier on, is how do you sow those seeds from an early age, from an early time with those communities that then embeds it within those communities and within their culture and so on, that their children are now going out as well. I know she's been out to Morocco and a whole range of other places with various groups to walk. But it's that sort of, and same with all those other young men in there as well. They're engaged and taking groups out from that community, and it's about how you instilled that from an early time. And I can tell you it was hard work. It wasn't easy. I had to visit every parent's house to convince them as to where I was taking. Whereas when I did my weekend in the Brecon Beacons, he knew exactly what was going on, and he was happy for our daughter to come along. Um, so it's about thinking, how do you embed that in different communities? What's the future look like? The way we protect and improve our landscapes needs to change radically. And particularly as they talked about, that if their natural beauty is to be in a better condition 70 years from today, even better to look at more biodiverse and alive with people from all backgrounds and parts of the country, they cannot carry on as they do now. And I think that's a really important message and a challenge that Glover has put to the sector. And this image was a couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago, um, where a group of a dozen people volunteered all around the country. I had people come in from Cambridge, from from West Midlands, from South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, for a weekend volunteering. But what was more interesting and challenging is that, and again, this is where we need to move away from that diversity washing and speaking, saying, yeah, we want to be inclusive, workforce, inclusive in volunteering governance, to actually doing. It took me 18 months to pull that weekend together because very few people or bodies were interested in actually supporting a volunteering weekend. There's something I've highlighted quite a few times, and this is where the cultural thing comes in. People assume volunteers. I remember challenging a national park a few years ago. I said, you're advertising an information session for volunteers on a weekday during the working day. So if you're a professional who's working or a young person who's at school or university, you're not going to attract those people because what you're telling me as a professional working in a senior role within the public sector is we only want people who are retired and who have spare time during the week. And I think those sort of approaches need to actually change and think about different approaches and thinking out the box to different models. I had a group of people who wanted to come along, but they're all professionals. I had two teachers, somebody who works senior in IT industry, somebody who works in local government with Send. So all 10 professional people working in different areas. who wants to volunteer, but their volunteer time is weekends. They all came and volunteered and were really engaged. And I think if the sector wants that inclusivity, then they need to invest in that and also look at things differently to engage with those new audiences. Because if we don't do that now, then who will be the future stewards of the national parks and national landscapes? And I think everyone should be reflected, reflected, and engage in the conservation of our landscapes, national parks, and the countryside. Support an inclusive new vision, because the problems are not are in the sector, not with the underserved communities, because the communities want to engage and want to do something, but it's the organisation who may have a challenge in looking at different approaches and different ways of doing those sort of things. There's also economic and social benefits to consider as well, which we don't always think about. The local economy benefits, the tourism sector benefits, employment benefits, small businesses benefit, farming benefits, health and social care. So again, it's sort of exploring those sort of benefits that inclusivity brings, that it's not just sort of getting visitors out and then that's it, our job's done. It's going beyond that. And if businesses can come on board as well, then it brings a lot more bigger focus to that work. Some reflections to ponder over, and moving on to sort of questions. I'm finishing off now. Dava's vision, and where are we now? What's happened in the last 75 years? National parks being relevant to a changing country, are they, and should they be? Are we systematically exclusive? Traditional versus non-traditional activities, providing for different family structures, implications for the future, who will care for the parks? We can't carry on as we are, or is there a view that we carry on as we are, which will mean that it goes back to systematically exclusive. And I think there's another thing that we need to think about is nothing about us without us. And I think whether you're looking at disability, whether you're looking at people from ethnically diverse background, we should be around those tables, and you should be having conversations with those communities and people in what you're trying to do. Because sometimes people will try and do something and it's not the right fit, and you need to make sure it's right fit for the community. And again, not one person can do that work either. It has to be a broader outreach program and an engagement that allows people to engage. And thank you very much. And I'll open it to questions.